Before we start the video, a large thank you to Milo, Ayob, and 11 for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is always greatly and sincerely appreciated, my friend. I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to continue with the FLASK. Let's jump over to the Player Network Manager right away here, and let's go and make a new server RPC. And this is going to be for actually hiding our weapons when we drink the FLASK. So let's call it Hide Weapons Server RPC. Let's copy that, make it into a client RPC, change the keyword server to client, again, server to client. And we're just going to basically make this hide our weapons, so whenever we're doing an action that involves any kind of quick item or any kind of thing where we're interacting with the environment, we can just use this in the future to hide our weapons when we do so. So if you are the server, let's call Hide Weapons Client RPC, and then the client RPC, let's just simply say player.player equipment manager. I believe we already have something for this, hide weapons. If not, we can just say right hand weapon model.set active false, and then do the same thing with the left hand weapon model. We might actually already have the hide weapons function there. I probably should check for that, but that's all right. So let's also check if they're null, just to be sure. They should never be null because even the unarmed weapon has a weapon model, but just in case, you never know, I'm just going to make a check here so it won't throw you an error. And I'm just going to do the same thing here too for the left hand weapon model. Okay, it looks good. I'm going to copy that and repaste it so it orients itself nicely. I'm going to save that. Now, let's go over to the Player Equipment Manager. Let's open that up. And then right down here, under Damage Colliders, I'm just going to make a function to unhide the weapons, public void unhide weapons. And now we're going to do the same thing, but just set them to active. Okay, looks good. Let's save that. Now let's go back into the project. Let's go to the FLASK item script, open that up. What we want to do now is call this RPC and the animation only for the owner. So let's say player.player network manager hide weapons server RPC. I'm going to change this client RPC to private because it does not need to be public. All right, going to save that. Going to jump back over here now to my FLASK script. I'm going to make a check for if the player is the owner, then we're going to play the animation and we're going to use the hide weapons server RPC. I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to go back over to the player network manager again. I'm going to minimize all of this. And then right below that, I'm going to make another server RPC, not serializable field. Server RPC, I'm going to call this public void notify the server. Now you can call this whatever you want, but it's going to be the function we call to use a quick slot item. So I'm going to call it notify the server of quick slot item action, server RPC. And then I'm going to make this require an oolong variable for the client ID and an integer variable for the quick slot item that we are using. So I'm then going to copy all of this and paste it again as a client RPC, changing the server keyword to client. Notify server of quick slot item action server RPC becomes client RPC. Next, I'm going to say if we are the server under notify server of quick slot item action server RPC, we're going to play the notify the server of quick slot item action client RPC. And then we're going to say if the client ID does not equal network manager.local client ID, then we're going to play that item action on this player by saying quick slot item is equal to, we're going to get it from the world item database.instance get quick slot item by ID, and then we're going to pass our quick slot item ID, and then we're going to say item.attempt to use item, and we're going to pass the player, as in this player character. Okay, cool, looks good. Now I'm going to go over here where it says send a server RPC. We're going to say player.player network manager.notify server quick slot item action server RPC. And we pass our local client ID. You can do this a number of ways. I'm going to use the network manager. So to do that, I'm going to have to go up here and say using unity.netcode. This is on the player input manager, by the way, in case you were confused. Up top, using unity.netcode. And then we will pass our network manager.singleton.local client ID. We pass the item ID of the item by saying player.player inventory manager.current quick slot item.item ID. And that's basically it. Now it will run on your character and it will send a server RPC so your character on anybody else's client you're playing with will start this action. All right, let's save that. let's go back here now, and I'm going to change this client RPC to private again. Don't need to have that public. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to the project. I'm going to look up the player network manager again. Click that. And come right up to the top. Let's make a header for FLASKS. And then I'm going to paste an integer variable here. I'm going to call this remaining health flasks. And do the same thing for your mana focus points, we're going to call it. Now, why am I doing this? Well, we need to keep track of the number we have so we can sync up if we're using the empty flask model or the live flask model if you run out of flasks midway through a chug. So this has to be network information so that your player object on another person's game, the flask can change if it empties out in the middle of the animation if you're chugging it. So I'm initializing both at 3, just so we have 3 by default. Just picking a random number here. There's no real reason why I chose 3. Let's go back to the flask item and let's make a variable here for the flask type. Now you can't make this into an enum if you don't like the look of a bool because you're going to be using if is this, otherwise it's this, and it makes an assumption. If you want to make an enum for the type health flask or mana flask, that's cool too. So I'm going to make another header for the restoration value here. The integer is going to be, we'll say flask restoration. I'll defaultly make it like 50 or something, or 55. And honestly, it doesn't even matter. Just any number right now so we know it works. And now we're going to use this health flask bool to determine if we're going to heal our health or our focus points. So back on the quick slot item, we have attempt to use item, but now we're going to make a virtual void for successfully use item. So here we have attempt. Let's change this to successfully. So the attempt is going to start you off by playing the animation and seeing if you can use it, and successfully will have the effect go off. So over here, override successfully use item. And now under successfully use item, this is where we're actually going to restore values. So let's override can I use item to. Now, you could start by saying if this is a health flask, and if you don't have any health left, or health flasks remaining, sorry, you could return false. And likewise, you could do the same with your mana flasks by saying if this is not a health flask and you don't have any focus point restoring flasks left, return false. Now, I'm going to get to why I'm not going to put it here, but we're still going to use that logic a bit in the future, and I'll explain why in a moment. But for now, let's just keep it here so we have something here, and we can make sure this is all working as intended. So if this is not a health flask, then we know it's a focus point flask. So we're going to compare our focus points flasks left, and if that equals less than or equals 0, return false. Otherwise, return true. Yeah, we can use it. So for now, this is great. Okay, so you're probably wondering why I don't check if we're interacting here, or rather performing an action and then returning. Well, I'll get to that in the future. I will explain there is a purpose why I'm not using that specific call, and you'll see why in a bit. But for now, let's continue. Under successfully use item, we're going to see if we are the owner. And if we are the owner, we're going to modify some network variables because we can only do that if we are the owner. So if this is a health flask, then we're going to modify our health. So we're going to say player.player network manager current health.value plus equals the restoration value. Now, if this is not a health flask, since there's only 2 flasks, it must be a focus point / mana flask. So we're going to say if it is not a health flask, then we can modify our current focus points value. I keep saying mana and typing mana because that's what I call it in Nephilim. Focus points, there we go. And there we have it. Cool, so what else needs to be done? Well, let's open up some brackets because this isn't just this one line of code. So I'm just going to put this in here, and we can use an else statement now also because there's only 2 types of flasks. If you have more than 2, then you use an enum definitely. Bools also kind of look messy. I'm not a big fan of the if-else personally when it has some kind of sorting name, but that's just me. I know it's just easy to do, so player.player network manager.remaining health flasks minus equals 1. So make sure you subtract the usage that you got from successfully using this item. You only subtract it when you actually successfully use the item, not when you're attempting to. There we go. Do the same thing for the focus points flask. And so far, so good. All right, so we have this empty flask item now. Now this is where we're going to start using this momentarily. So let's copy all this logic, but don't copy the owner check. Now, if this is a health flask, let's do this one first. And we're going to compare the health flask value. So if this is a health flask and the health flask value is less than or equal to 0, we know we are out. So what do we do then? Well, we want to instantiate the empty flask, but first we're going to have to destroy the current flask by saying destroy player.player effects manager active quick slot item effects. And then we want to instantiate in place our new empty flask. So we can say local variable game object empty flask is equal to instantiate the empty flask item. And if you remember correctly, it's going to be at the right-hand weapon player transform if you're using our animations, because it brings the flask in the right hand. If it's the left hand for you, use that or use wherever you want to put it. So I'm going to reference the right hand by saying player.player.equipmentmanager.right-hand-weapon-slot.transform. And then we need to assign this empty flask to the player effects active quick slot item effects variable by saying active quick slot item effects is equal to the empty flask we just instantiated. Now, do the exact same thing for your mana flask by saying if this is not a health flask and the current remaining focus points flasks, and I wasn't supposed to check current health, by the way, that's my bad. I was supposed to check remaining health flasks. Just going to correct that real fast. Then we're going to check the remaining focus points flasks. Then you want to do the same thing. Cool. All right. Now, after all of that down here, you could play some effects here. So I'm going to quickly just make a function for that. Private void play, we can say healing effects or restoration effects because it's both. I'll just keep healing effects for now because we're just going to use the same effects for both. Just going to show you how it's done. I totally encourage you, obviously, to use different effects for both and tune them. In Nephilim, mine's blue for mana. I think mine's like a golden orangey color for healing. So I'm going to quickly go to the player, not the player combat manager, the player equipment manager, actually. You can put it in either, to be honest. So either on the player combat or the player equipment manager. For me, it makes more sense to go on the player equipment manager. So, or rather the player combat manager, apologies. So we're going to go there. We're going to make a void for successfully use quick slot item. So you see we have successfully cast spell, successfully charge spell, etc. We're going to make right below that successfully use quick slot item. Then we're going to say player.player inventory manager current quick slot item dot successfully use item past the player. Now, this is going to be our animation event. So we're going to say if the player current quick slot item does not equal null, otherwise you get an error. But if you're calling this animation event, it should not be, but just in case. So let's do that. And now let's copy the name of this function and let's go to wherever we use our flask, and right when it tips up here, that's where you want to use that. So right about here for me, I'm going to say frame 15 looks really good. I'm going to paste successfully use quick slot item and apply that. Cool. Okay, let's go back over into the Flask item script. Let's make a header now in here. We're going to call this effects. Going to make a serializable field for the audio clip. If you want, you can put them here, but I'm going to not do that. I'm just going to show you this is also acceptable. Audio clip here, and then you can do your particle effects here wherever you want, or whatever kind of effects you want to instantiate in the world. You call this like healing particles. The reason why I don't do this is because you have multiple flasks, you have to make it multiple times and drag them multiple times. So I'm going to go to the world sound effect manager and the world character effect manager. And I'm going to put the drinking sound effect under the action sounds in the world sound effect manager. Going to make it public healing sound effect. And then I'm going to call it healing flask sound effect actually. And I'm going to go to the world effect manager here, and I'm going to make a particle effect for this and call this healing flask VFX. I'm just going to use the same VFX and sound effects for both flasks. But again, I encourage you, if you want, to use them differently and make different ones. Get creative. I'm just using this because it's just a quick prototype to show you what I'm doing. So under play healing effects, under the Flask item script, let's instantiate world character effects manager.instance.healing VFX. And I'm going to do it on the player's transform. So to do that, I'm going to make this require you pass a player manager variable. I'm going to say player.transform. And I'm going to get the sound effects to play by referencing the player.player sound effect manager. I'm now realizing we only have a character sound effect manager because there's no need for a player sound effect manager. I'm going to say .play sound effects. I'm going to pass the world sound effect manager.instance.healing flask sound effect. And then I'll come back up here, pass the player in this function where I call it after everything else, and we're going to save, and that's good. Now, I'm going to quickly add utility destroy after time on my healing effects that I've quickly slapped together in like 60 seconds in Unity. And I'm going to go to the world character effects manager, drag in my healing effects. Again, this isn't required, but if you have some effects you want to throw on, do that now. And then I'm going to go to the world sound effect manager and drag in a sound effect I yoinked from Nephilim. Let's see, here we go. Oh, looks like my prefab and my in-scene prefab aren't synced up, so I'm just going to do that real quick because that should never be a thing. I'm going to drag in my world sound effect manager from the scene and overwrite my prefab. There we go, cool. All right, you guys probably can't hear this because I'm not recording audio in the game, but I'm going to test this out now. So I'm going to go and set my remaining flash to 3 and put my flask in my current quick slot item. And I drink it, and boom, there's the particle effects. And yes, the sound effect does play. Cool. And you can see my health also goes up. Perfect. Working as intended. Awesome. Okay, we still have a few things to do. So let's go back to the flask item. Now, Can I use this item is correct. So we can still use the item if we're out, which is why I'm not putting these here. So I'm going to delete these. But we can use the item at a cost of it basically giving us nothing and making us walk around for a moment to punish us for spamming the heal button. So if the player is owner under attempt to use item, or sorry, we don't need that right away. First, we're going to check to see if the flasks are at 0. So if the flasks are less than equal to 0 and you're using each flask, so make a check for each specific flask. If this is health flask and health flasks are less than equal to 0, if this is the mana flask and mana flasks are less than equal to 0, then copy your code down here where you instantiate the empty version of the flask, paste it in both of these. So I'm going to make comments after too, so this is a bit clear. That's why I'm not a big fan of the if statements as opposed to like an enum and labeling it. It just doesn't look as nice. So we're going to return after we go ahead and instantiate that flask. But before we return, we're also going to check if we're the owner, and we're going to play the empty animation instead of the animation to actually drink. So this punishes you basically for spamming the heal button without checking your flask count. So we're going to say if we are the owner, play animation, and we're going to say empty flask item animation, which we don't have yet as a local variable, so I will make that right now. And again, I will supply the empty flask animation for patrons like last time in the description. String empty flask animation. And I'm just going to paste this as the variable name here as well. All right, cool. In the future also, I think we're going to throw this into some sort of animation pack with a bunch of other actions, so that will be out there as well. Maybe then we'll make it into a blend tree as well, as opposed to just a stationary where you have to apply an upper body mask. So we want to basically make this animation play, and we still want to allow our movement and rotation, so that's good. Save that. Now I'm going to make 2 comments here, health flash check and focus points flash check, so it's just more neat, and we can see that each of these functions are checked in a separate flask. And then we're going to go over to our flasks and paste in the animation name on the empty flask animation string variable. And if we go into the game here now and I keep drinking, you can see I can spam drink. We're going to fix that. But when I get to empty, you can see, boom, the flask is empty. Cool. Excellent. But because I can spam drink, you can see I can actually spawn a bunch of these in my hand, which is not what we want. So we're going to make a check for that amongst some other checks as well. Let's go back into the flask. You can see here we're actually interacting, but we actually don't want to do that. I'm going to get to that in a minute. We're not going to change it just yet, but I'll explain why. Player Combat Manager, you can make a public bool for is using item and initialize that of false by default. And now we're going to say right up top here, player combat manager dot is using item is equal to true. Now we don't set it right here, but we're going to set it in a moment. So let's just copy that. So we need to make this in a few weird places, and you'll see why momentarily. So right here, we're going to say inside the health flask check, we're going to say if the player combat manager is using item, return. Otherwise, yes, the player is now using an item, and then proceed with the empty flask, and then basically get out of here after you play the empty animation. Cool. All right, what if the flask is not empty? Well, because we can chug the flask while we're already using it, we need to check for the chugging before we actually abort out of it if we are using it. So we're going to say if player combat manager is using item, then we're going to say player, if the player is the owner, we're going to basically set the player network manager is chugging to true. Now this doesn't exist yet, so we're going to go ahead and make it. This is going to be the variable that changes our animator state to is chugging, which will make you keep drinking over and over again before leaving the animation. So I'm going to copy any bool we have here that's a network variable and paste it under flasks and change it to is chugging. Defaultly initialize that false. Now, if we are using the item and we set chugging true, we're going to return. Nothing else we need to do there. Finally, down here, we're going to simply say player combat manager is using item is equal to true. All right, cool. Save that. Now you can see we have the chugging flask variable here. That's going to be changed by is chugging network variable, basically. So let's go anywhere down here now and make an on is chugging changed. We're going to say public void on is chugging changed. Then we're going to make this have an old status, new status. You've done this now at least a dozen times, I think. And we're just going to simply set the animator state for is chugging flask to the status of the is chugging bool network variable by saying player.animator set bool is chugging flask to is chugging .value. Now make sure you copy the name of the animator parameter. Mine is chugging flask. Yours could be different. Go back to the Flask item, and under can I use this item, I'm going to say if player.player combat manager is using item, is not using item, sorry, and the player is performing action, we are going to simply return false. Okay, then I'm going to say if player.player network manager is attacking, we're going to return false. Let's save that. Let's go down here now, and we want to make is performing action false. Now, I know this doesn't make sense right now, but it will, and I will explain why when we get to it. I just don't want to overload you guys with information. So we want to be able to rotate and move, but we want to be able to not perform an action while we're doing this. It will make sense momentarily. So I'm just going to paste this animation chain logic here to all these play target action animations. Save that. Okay, over on reset upper body, we're going to say player.player equipment manager dot unhide weapons. We're going to do this regardless if you're the owner or not. And then we're going to say if player.player combat manager is using item, we're going to say player.player combat manager is using item equals false. And then we're going to say if player.is performing action, is not performing action, sorry, then we're going to allow our player to roll again. And we're going to do that by setting a bool called can roll to true, which doesn't exist yet. So we're going to go ahead and make that. Now, why am I doing this here? Well, again, this ties into the whole method of why we're not using is performing action, and it will make sense momentarily. I'll come back here and make a comment, and then we'll walk through it, and I'll explain why. So let's go over now right above that and say if player.player effect manager dot active quick slot effects is not equal null, we're going to simply destroy those effects. So we're going to say destroy player.player effects manager active quick slot effects. All right, cool. Let's go now and make that bool for can roll. You put it on the player combat manager, which is fine. But to me personally, it makes more sense on the player locomotion manager. So I'm going to do that instead. So I'm going to copy it and remove it from here. And it would actually go on the character locomotion, sorry, not the player locomotion, or the character combat manager. So I'm going to say character locomotion manager can roll is equal to true. Whoops, I'm going to erase that. Go to the character locomotion manager and paste it here. Public bool can roll defaultly set to true. Now under our reset action flag, we're going to set it back to true. So if you're done an action, you can roll again. Just like that. And now we need to make sure we set this up under here. We can erase that comment under our reset upper body action. And also we need to put this on our player locomotion manager before we check to roll. So no longer are we checking for is performing action. We're going to check to see if we can roll. So player.player locomotion manager can roll. If you can't roll, return. This is in the future where if you want some actions to be interactable, but still allow rolling out of them or canceling them, this is where this comes in handy, such as emotes or something like that. So under play target action animation, we're going to set bool default can rolls equal to false. So by default, unless you change this, where every time you do an action, you can't roll until the action is done. And then I'm going to set this on play target action animation instantly, the same thing. And then lastly, we can also do it on play target attack animation, same thing. Although I don't think you'd ever want to roll when you can attack, so, but just in case. So then we're going to say character locomotion manager can roll is equal to can roll. Do that for all three of these. You don't need to change the server RPC stuff because again, these are all local variables that are checking for the owner only. So you don't need to put them anywhere else, just these three functions. Okay, cool. Now, looks good. Let's save that. Now, if I go into the game here now, I'm going to just drink. Oh, I didn't enable rotation. You can see I can attack. That's what I wanted to show you. We don't want to be able to attack while we're drinking. So go to your actions, your attack actions, and make a check for if you're using item simply return. Now, if you want to modify this to make one for can attack, you can. Just be aware that there are certain interactions such as jumping where you want to enable can attack, where it will be disabled by default. I'm just going to use is using item because I'm very deep in the development of Nephilim and I've never had any other interaction where I'd need to make not attacking true because it just syncs up with this performing action. But if you want it for neatness sake, can attack, can roll, etc., you can basically refactor it to do that. So I'm just going down through all my item actions now. I'm checking for if I'm using the item, and if I'm using the item, I'm going to return. We don't want to do attack actions at the same time we're doing item actions. So checking for all of those here, if we're using an item in any capacity, we're just going to simply return and not allow that action to process. Okay, cool. So what's next? Go back to the Flask item. And now right here, I made a mistake. Actually, sorry, there's actually no rotation here. So make sure you enable can rotate by switching that flag to true. I made a mistake here last time. I actually made it false. That's why I couldn't rotate when I was showing you that I could attack during the time I was using that item. All right, cool. Save that. Next, we're going to do a hide weapons server RPC if we are the owner as well as playing our action animation. So we're hiding the weapon too if our flask becomes empty. And then back over here on the reset upper body, now I will just explain what's happening. So basically, if you were to drink your flask and you were using is performing action, and you reset is performing action here, if someone hit you at the same time, right, and you reset rolling, then if you finish the flask drinking animation before that damage animation gets back to reset action on the override layer, then you would be able to roll midway through that damage animation. So that's why we're not using a normal checking for is performing action, and we're giving it its own thing. Now this could be mitigated if this was a blend tree and you had it on the same layer, the action override layer, because then basically when you got hit into the damage animation, it would cancel the flash drinking animation. But because it's on a different layer, both can play at the same time, so both go back to their empty states and both can reset variables. So we need to be careful to replace that. Now if I go into the game here, I can drink this. There we go. I'm drinking it. I drink it again, and everything seems to be working as intended. I can't attack, and then it turns to empty when I'm done. Now, we didn't implement chugging yet, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to the player manager now, and let's go down to our equipment. Let's call player network manager .is chugging .on value change is going to be equal to player network manager .on is chugging changed. And then we're going to do the same thing on network despawn, and use the minus equals to unsubscribe from the function. So is chugging changed, and I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it right below on current quick slot item ID change, just like that. Looks good. Minus equals save. Cool. And now we need to make one more script. Reset is chugging. This is an animator script. Needed to be on both item flash drink 01 and 02. So let's double click that, go in here, and we're going to do on state enter. We're going to override public void. Going to drop in our namespace as is per tradition. And I am going to just quickly copy variables from other animator resets here and pause the video to save some time. There we go. Checking for the player after null return. Next, we're going to check and see if we're chugging the flask. If we are, we're going to get the flask item by referencing our current quick slot item as a flask item. And then we're going to make the health flask an empty flask item and empty flask animation public variables so we can reference them from this animator script. Public, public, public. Looks good. Save that. We're going to say if the current health flask, then we're going to do health flask things. Otherwise, it is a focus points flask. So if we are chugging the flask, what do we need to do? Well, we need to check if it's health flask. We're going to say if player.playerNetworkManager.remainingFlasks.value is less or equal to 0, we want to cancel this animation immediately and play the empty animation as well as instantiate the empty flask and destroy the regular flask. Then do the same thing here for your remaining mana flasks. Because if you try to enter this animation and there's no flask left, we have to say nope, cancel it, play the empty animation, and instantiate the dead flask instead of the flask that has stuff in it. So we're going to copy that whole thing here now, and then we're going to delete everything inside of these statements. So basically, we just needed it for the check for health flask and check for mana flask. And we're also going to check to see if we are the owner, because only the owner does this one. And this is where we're actually going to play the animation. So the bottom one is played by both people because there's no owner check. And that's where we're going to instantiate the dead flask. And this one is played by the owner only, which will force the character to play the animation. And then we're going to say current flask.empty animation. And we're going to hide our weapons with the hide weapons server RPC as well. So if we're the owner, play the empty animation, and both players, if we're out of flasks, instantiate the dead flask in the hand. And it's cool too because we have a network variable, so we can check for this mid-drink, and then we can have it go from glowing to dead. All right, right down now on reset is chugging. We're lastly going to say if player is the owner, we're going to say player.playerNetworkManager is chugging is equal to .false. So if you want to keep chugging, you got to hit it again by hitting the use item button on your inputs. And I'll make a comment here, reset is chugging. And we can save. All right, so I'm gonna go and make my current quick slot item 17, so we get the flask inventory, and now I will walk around, drink it, and if I keep tapping the use button, yes, I keep chugging without the flask going down, and then I'm empty, and the flask turns to that dull color, and then I'm out. So there you go, guys. You have a flask system that you can use to heal your players' health and mana. So one more time before we go, I will quickly go over why we didn't use its performing action. So if you open your project right now and look at it, you can see our upper body layer is on a different layer than our action override layer on the animator. Now, if we had a blend tree of drinking animations, we could apply that blend tree down into the action override layer, and then we could still use is performing action. We could do this because if we got hit by a character and played a damage animation, it would basically play an animation on the same layer, thus canceling the drinking animation. So it's not a big deal because then our flags would reset at the same time anyway. But because we can play two animations at the same time, for example, if you're drinking your flask and I hit you, because the drinking animation is on a different layer than the damage animation, you play two of these animations at the same time. And if the drinking animation gets back to reset action flag before the damage animation and you allow it to reset its performing action there, then you can do a whole bunch of things while you're still taking a damage animation, and that's not what we want. So in a perfect world, you could actually refactor this to make the drinking animations a blend tree, which maybe we'll do in the future. Maybe we can release these animations as a blend tree, but it's not a big deal. Both work exactly the same way. One's just a little bit neater. So that is why we're using an is using item check, and we have it on a different layer because we want to be able to walk around while we're drinking. If you don't want to walk around and we'll have it stationary, like Dark Souls 1 I believe does that, then you can just go ahead and put that in the override layer and just use the old system. All right, guys, so the next few videos will be getting all this stuff to work in the UI and saving it and such. So we're gonna have the equipping our quick slot items in the UI, equipping our our archery items in the UI. So I'm gonna ask for Ash of War equipments to the UI, so we'll do that as well as saving it to our character and saving Ashes of Wars to weapons and stuff like that. So as always, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. A special and immense thank you to my Patrons. This is because of each and every one of you get to keep doing this. You have my immense gratitude. All right, guys, that's it for me. I will see you next week.